Why is it that they call it hard money? Well, very simply because it is hard to inflate. That is the case with precious metals, for example. It is difficult to inflate the supply of gold and silver. And this is why gold and silver in the past served as excellent hard money. But why is it that money should be difficult to inflate, if not impossible? Why is it that money works better when its total supply is static, fixed, when its total supply is unchangeable? With Bitcoin, we have not hard money in the sense that it is difficult to change its total supply. We have something that we've never seen before. It's a money that is simply impossible to inflate. It's impossible to change the fact that Bitcoin's hard cap is 21 million. And yes, I know technically it's theoretically possible that everyone in the Bitcoin network agrees collectively to inflate the supply. Technically that is possible. It would be a soft fork, but there's very strong game theoretical reasons for this not happening. Everyone that owns Bitcoin has an economic stake in the total supply not inflating. There's no game theoretical reason why everyone would agree to inflate the supply of Bitcoin. And that's kind of the point, is the supply of Bitcoin is eternally fixed, and that is why it has value. So the point of this video is to explore why is it that a fixed supply of money is so important. What is it about hard money that makes it last generations, thousands of years? What is it about hard money that makes it preferable to fiat? What is it about having a fixed supply of something that makes it serve as better money? Well, I came across an interesting analogy in this regard, reading a book about the Middle Ages. And in this book, it touched upon an interesting topic in relation to indulgences. What were indulgences? Originally in the year 1100, when the Crusades were first starting, the Pope announced that anyone who participated in the Crusades would be granted immediate entry into heaven if they died on the crusade. And this was considered to be a privilege of the Pope, to have this type of power, to announce, to essentially grant to anyone who died in the crusade immediate entry into heaven. This was an example of the Pope's power to essentially, by fiat, by declaration, he had this incredible power, an incredible power to incentivize people. You know, if you're granted immediate entry into heaven for participating in this campaign, well, that's an incredible power to wield. Now, here's the problem, though. Originally, when this happened, it was a very rare event. It was considered a privilege to be exercised by the Pope in the event of extraordinary circumstances. Now, just to touch base on how this connects to fiat currency, this sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Oh, we have to go off the gold standard because there's a war. Right? There's always some extraordinary circumstance that justifies is essentially willing money into existence. There's always some emergency that will come along that will justify it. So going back to the history of indulgences in medieval Europe, what happened is that over the years, following the Crusades, following the original use of the Pope's power to grant immediate entry into heaven, this power began to be sold for money. Because if all you have to do is by fiat grant someone immediate entry into heaven, or by fiat to grant them forgiveness for their sins, well, if that's all you have to do is to speak those words and people will pay for it, well, that's very tempting. And what gradually happened over time is that the power of the church to grant these exceptions, or to grant these fiat declarations of salvation or forgiveness or so forth, it itself suffered from inflation. This is very interesting. In the book, the author R.W. Southern writes, "It is inflation of a particular kind, for the treasure which provided the backing, so to speak, for the spiritual currency was limitless." That's very interesting. Nevertheless, the consequences of the unrestricted issue of these documents, referring to indulgences, were similar to those which face other issues of paper money. The abundance of the notes brought about a decline in the value attached to them. Very interesting. So we have this situation in which it is originally the Pope granting entry into heaven if you die in the Crusade was a very a solemn event. This rare declaration, this rare granting by the Pope of something very precious. But over time, that power was abused to the point that it lost its luster, that it lost the value, because the privilege to grant by spiritual fiat things like forgiveness or eternal salvation, this was a privilege, a power that it simply was irresistible. And it began as a sort of one-time event, or an extremely rare power that was exercised by the Pope, but just a couple centuries later, it became widespread. Like it was used at every occasion and at every level. So it wasn't just the Pope that was making these granting indulgences in exchange for money often. It got to the point where these the printing of this spiritual fiat was being done at the local level by priests, not even in exchange for money, just to curry favor, or just to please people. Because if you can just print this spiritual fiat out of nothing, and people believe in it, well, the natural outcome of that is going to be to exercise that power into oblivion, which is exactly what happened. By the 14th century, there were, quote, remissions at the hour of death, remissions for a single danger of death, remissions for a multiplicity of dangers of death, remissions obtainable from the papal chancery, remissions obtainable for those commissioned by the Pope for this purpose, remissions for pilgrims to Rome, remissions without any condition whatever. And he concludes by saying, once the bottomless treasure had been opened, there could be no restraining its distribution. So it isn't even there. It's not that there was a nefarious agenda involved here. It's that No one can resist the power to print by fiat, either money or, in this case, what amounts to spiritual currency. It's an irresistible temptation. Any time that you have something of value that can be printed by fiat, that privilege will be abused. In this case, what originally started as essentially a very rare or even a one-time event, a privileged exercise of the Pope's power, what originally was used to essentially spiritually finance the Crusades, just a couple centuries later devolved into hyperinflation, spiritual hyperinflation. And Professor Southern, he concludes that by the end of the 15th century, it would not have taken a very far-sighted prophet or a profound student of economics to see that the day would soon come when the questions would be asked. What, after all, was the backing for the papal currency of indulgences? And what would happen when it finally was presented for payment? And the answer to that is there was a final reckoning. The spiritual hyperinflation that occurred from the granting of indulgences, it ultimately resulted in the Reformation. The granting of indulgences was not the only reason for the Reformation, but it certainly was a critical factor. It certainly was a trigger, because eventually people came to see that this ability to print spiritual fiat was being wildly abused by the institution of the church. And I need to stress that it's not the case that there was a nefarious agenda involved here. It just was a natural outcome. Being able to print spiritual fiat is a power that humans are not capable of resisting. And to bring this back to money, the same is true. This is a power that is impossible to resist. As soon as this power is exercised once, it is simply a matter of time before the power will be wildly abused. There is always some excuse to go off the gold standard and to inflate the money supply by fiat. There's always some war, there's always some emergency, and there always will be. There always will be some circumstance where the politicians or the leaders get together and say, look, we value hard money, but this is an emergency. We're going to have to make an exception. It always happens. And the result is always the same. The power that originally was exercised for an emergency just becomes commonplace. This is the history of fiat money in a nutshell. It always ends the same way. It always ends in wild abuse, because humans and human institutions cannot resist that power. Just as the church could not resist the power of being able to print spiritual fiat, and it led to the Reformation. It led to, well, let's put it this way. The history of indulgences, which is essentially the printing of spiritual fiat, it's not just that it led to a sort of a dry academic rejection of this practice. It's not just that some priests or some bishops got together and decided, well, we've gone too far with this. We really need to restrain our spending, so to speak. We really need to stop abusing this power. It wasn't just a sort of academic event that we're talking about here. The abuse led to the Reformation, which led to the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, a direct consequence of the Reformation, which was itself a direct consequence of the abuse of indulgences. And what was the 30 Years' War? It was a period of massive social and political disintegration. It's one of the most destructive wars in European history. There's parts of Germany that experienced 50% declines in their population. The death toll of the 30 Years' War is between 4 and 8 million. And that's 4 to 8 million people in a time when the population of Europe was a lot less than it was in the 20th century. If you're wanting to compare death tolls to the world wars, for example. So there is major social and political implications to abusing the power of fiat printing, whether it is spiritual fiat or monetary. And this is why, to bring this to full circle back to Bitcoin, this is why it is so important that Bitcoin's supply is constrained. This is why we need Bitcoin. Because we need hard money. Because if you don't have hard money and you are simply printing money out of thin air, printing it by fiat, that power can and will be abused. It is being abused. And it's not just economic consequences that follow. The abuse of fiat printing leads to war. It leads to social and political disintegration. It leads to destruction. This is what makes Bitcoin's hard cap its 21 million fixed supply, which is eternal. This is what makes that aspect of Bitcoin so important. Because when Bitcoin is adopted either by an individual or an institution or a government, there's no cheating it. There is no fudging the numbers. Whatever Bitcoin you have is the Bitcoin that you have. That is the money that you have to operate with, and that's all there is to it. And it forces you to be very discerning when it comes to allocating your capital and your resources. When you don't have the ability to simply print money out of thin air by fiat, it really forces you to evaluate your priorities. And on the level of the state and the government, if wars were not able to be financed through money printing, how many wars would have been avoided? How many wars are committed to because the government knows they can finance them through money printing, through inflation? If they didn't have this ability, how many wars would have been avoided? Because if you have to pay for a war up front, there's much more of a disincentive to commit to that war. There's more of an incentive to find ways to avoid the war. And this is why Bitcoin is so important. And this is why I believe supporting Bitcoin by buying and hodling is not just about improving your own economic position. It's about supporting the phenomenon of hyper-Bitcoinization. And to the extent that hyper-Bitcoinization occurs and Bitcoin becomes the settlement layer between nation states, well, if that occurs and no nation state has the ability to print Bitcoin out of thin air, you are supporting a phenomenon that structurally disincentivizes war. And all you have to do is buy Bitcoin and hold it. You don't have to vote. You don't have to rely upon politicians. You don't have to trust your government. You don't have to you don't have to protest or riot. You just exchange your fiat for Bitcoin as a political act. You reject the fiat currency system by exchanging that dirty money, that blood money, for Bitcoin. That is all you have to do. That is the power of Bitcoin, not just as a monetary technology, but as a political technology. Humanity has desperately needed a money that cannot be inflated by fiat, because the printing of value by fiat, whether spiritual or economic, only ever ends not in salvation but in ruin.